Good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda DeMeo, and on behalf of Darien Library, I want to welcome you to the Shakers Just Say No. The Shakers abstained from sex and, gasp, thrived. Their communal life devoted to equality, humility, pacifism, and denial of self has resulted in well over 200 years of influence on America's economy, society, and culture. We're joined tonight by Cindy Dickinson, who is the Director of Education at Hancock Shaker Village in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. The Hancock Shaker Village is a national historical landmark and living history museum that celebrates the lives and history of the Shakers. Before we begin, I would like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections available to the community. We thank you for, if you have any questions this evening, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the program. And we will be happy to answer them for you. And now I'm going to pass the mic over to Cindy.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I am very happy to be here with all of you this evening. Just making sure you can hear me okay.
Yes, I'm just replacing your spotlight.
That is okay. I am happy to be coming to you from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, just a bit north of you, and to talk about a wonderfully interesting group of people who are still around today. So I want to make sure that if you remember nothing else, there are still Shakers with us today. And while I will say this is an all age appropriate program, we won't be getting into too much detail about what celibacy is or isn't. We'll talk about the whys, but I am prepared to answer any questions that you may have. The village is closed for the season right now, but we are getting ready to open in April, and I hope that this talk might inspire you to come visit us. So you're seeing a view of Hancock Shaker Village. This is a view from our well-known roundstone barn, which I will show you a photo of in a bit. And one of the things that you'll learn as we go through is that the Shakers lived in community. The Shakers are a Protestant Christian religious group. And one of the things that literally sets them apart from other religious groups is that they live together. And so they left behind all but one, a legacy of buildings and material culture all over the northeastern United States. So we're going to explore that tonight. I like to start with this contrast of images because a 20th century Shaker once said that she did not wish to be remembered as a chair. One of the objects that we are often familiar with, and when someone says Shaker, we first think of furniture, because the Shakers are well known for making beautiful, simple, some would say, furniture in a style that really fits particularly the modern aesthetic. They weren't making it for that purpose. They were making it to sit on. But the Shakers are really, because of their interest in perfection, that applies to all of the things that they did, including their furniture and some of the products that exist that are still around. So we're going to try to learn more about them as more than chairs, but they do have really nice chairs, so we don't want to forget that either. What they're better known for and what they're named for is what they did in their religious services. And you see an image of that on the right. They shook. They were called the Shaking Quakers when they first got started, and we'll talk a bit more about their origins in a moment. But shaking Quakers was meant to be a put down. It was a negative term. Other people called them that because they were people who worshiped without a minister. They worshiped when the Spirit moved them, and when the Spirit moved them, it literally moved them, and they would tremble or fall on the floor and writhe around. They might shout out in tongues. And this is not, those of you who may be churchgoers probably haven't seen that happen too often in your congregations, if you are a New England Protestant at least. So this was considered not good behavior. But the Shakers kind of liked this nickname because their Their official name was the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. That's a little bit of a mouthful. So Shakers it became, and Shakers is how we know them. So keep this image, these two images in mind as we continue through this introduction to this really interesting group. The Shakers now are a uniquely American religion, but their origins are found in England, particularly Manchester, England, in the northern part, the industrial part, in the mid-18th century. A lot of religious dissent in England at the time. Lots of people not too happy with the formal state religion. So there were lots of dissenting groups cropping up here and there. This particular group that became known as the Shakers was formed from people who were Quakers. Some were a French Protestant group called the Camisards. There were a few Methodists involved. And as I mentioned, these were people who felt that God could speak directly to them without the intervention of a professional, paid professional, and that God spoke joyfully and physically. And one of the people who was really moved by this type of religious experience was a woman named Anne Lee. And on the right, this is a posthumous drawing of Anne Lee. So she hopefully looked a little bit more, but maybe her forehead was slightly less high. But Anne Lee was a dynamic figure. She was the daughter of a blacksmith. She married the apprentice of her father and had 4 pregnancies end with no live births. So all of 4 of her children died in infancy. And this experience of marriage, a not so happy marriage, and difficulty in parenting is partly what led to her interest in a religion that was celibate. Also in a religion that treated men and women equally. And those became foundational beliefs and are foundational beliefs for the Shakers. When you worship by whirling around and dancing and maybe disrupting a more formal service, and when you have some more radical beliefs like this, what often happened in England is people were put in jail, they were persecuted. So at that time, of course, often persecuted religious people decided they would head overseas to America. And that is what the Shakers did in 1774, after about 20 or 30 years of not such happy times in Manchester. A few of them, 9 to be exact, boarded a ship and headed over to New York. They landed in New York in August of 1774, and eventually made their way up river, up the Hudson, to Albany. And there the first Shaker community was established. This is by the 1780s. Mother Ann, as she began to be known, and her followers settled in what you see as number 1 on the map that I'm showing here. And she traveled throughout New England to preach a message that really embraced all people. It preached salvation if you would lead a sinless life. And it really welcomed everyone. Now, this is a time when people never really necessarily knew where their next meal was coming from if they lived in a rural area. And they certainly didn't know, there was no guarantee of eternal life after death. So here comes a woman who's preaching a fairly positive message about the future. And she was quite dynamic. So she attracted quite a few followers. And as you can see from the number of numbers on the map, at least 11 communities of Shakers sprung up in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Hancock Shaker Village, where I am, is number 3 on the map. And the one Connecticut community, which was at Enfield, is number 4 on the map that you see. I believe it is now part of your state prison system, so I hope you don't have reason to go visit it, but it was a thriving community and was part of a subdivision of Shaker communities with Hancock. So we have a fair number of ties with Enfield. The one remaining community is Sabbath Day Lake. That's up in Maine, and that's number 11 on the map. There are 2 Shakers living there, and they are supported by the wider community in Maine. Very interested. Brother Arnold, who is kind of the spokesperson for the Shakers, is also a dynamic person and has a fairly large web presence. So I would encourage you to look him up after this presentation is over. You'll notice some numbers over in the Midwest, or the what was the West when the Shakers were forming. And they were part of a Western campaign that the Shakers undertook out to Ohio and Kentucky and a bit in Indiana in the very early 19th century. But what you see on the map represents the principal settlements for the Shakers. There were a few southern experiments in the late 19th century in Florida and in Georgia, and then one very interesting urban community in Philadelphia in the second half of the 19th century, which was principally a Black community. So lots of interesting history within the Shakers. At their height, in terms of numbers, there were 5,000 or 6,000 Shakers in these communities, and that would have been in the mid-19th century, and representing 19 or 20 communities overall. So not a lot of people, but they have had a significant impact on American history and culture. I want to talk a little bit more about their beliefs. Theology, I'm not a theologian, but I think understanding a little bit more about Shaker values and beliefs and practices is helpful in understanding in sort of how they have developed as a society and as a religion. I've mentioned a few of them, but we'll go over them again. So a principal belief, as I mentioned, a foundational belief, is that celibacy leads to a sinless life and reinforces equality through separation. So this is one of the interesting manifestations of the Shakers' understanding about men and women and equality, is that it was best if they were kept separate but treated equally. So within a Shaker community, particularly for the first 100 years or so, men and women lived in the same buildings, but lived on separate sections of the buildings. They worked very hard, but they worked at separate tasks. They ate in the same room, but on separate sides of the room. So that's kind of how they realized the reality of their sense of equality. And of course, living a sinless life was extremely important to them as followers, as Christians, and as people who believed that they were into the second coming of Christ. And many of them came to believe that Mother Ann was the female embodiment of Christ on earth. And so hence their name. God is male and female. God is not Father God. God has elements of both genders in this case. The Shakers did live in a binary world, so they would see men and women exclusively. But their feeling was that if God is responsible for creating humanity and there are men and women, then, and God, the humans are a reflection of God, then God has got to have some female qualities and characteristics. So again, Mother Ann is sort of the mother God figure on earth. And it is also from this belief that equality among and between men and women is supported. The Shakers also believed in equality really for all people. So people of different racial backgrounds, people of different physical abilities, all were in theory welcome into the Shaker community. I want to point out the image on the right. This is what's called a gift drawing. These are visual representations of images that Shakers received from God or another spirit that they translated into text and image. And this is kind of like the Shaker family tree. So the figure you can see in the upper left, there's like a blue dress, and it's kind of hard to see that the person has blonde hair, but that's Mother Ann. And then below her is Jesus Christ. So in the Shaker world, Mother Ann ranked above Jesus. And then the man on the far right on the upper line is actually Christopher Columbus. Columbus does not have such a great reputation any longer, but to the Shakers, he was responsible for finding the New World and making it possible for them to live out their religion in a place that offered religious freedom. So they ranked him very highly in their family tree. The Shakers, although they have no minister for their worship services, they're sort of spirit-led. They do have a system of leadership within each community, and the elders and eldresses were entrusted with helping the Shakers to lead a sinless life. So confession of things that you didn't do well was important. It wasn't regularly practiced or scheduled, but when you felt that you had something to share that was on your mind, that was bothering you, you would speak to your elders if you were a woman or a sister in the community, and you would speak to the elder if you were a brother or male member of the community. One of the ways that the Shakers exemplified equality between men and women is that all positions of leadership were shared. So there were men and women in this spiritual leadership. There were men and women in charge of managing the day-to-day work of the village, and there were men and women in charge of the finances of the village. The Shakers were humble people. We talk about them as the Shakers, and we don't often talk about individuals because they wanted to be known and seen as a group. It was more important, the union of their community was more important than an individual rising above or excelling or being better than someone else. So being humble was a way to exemplify order. And I have an image on the right of a worship service. This is a little bit later than the image I showed you earlier. And you notice that they are walking around, their hands are out and their heads are slightly bowed. This is a gesture of humility and also of openness. The hands out are to symbolize they're ready to receive blessings that God may be raining down on them from heaven. So a lot of their worship came to represent through gesture the values that they held and the beliefs that they held. The Shakers are a pacifist group. I mentioned that some of them started out as Quakers, and that's one of the things that Shakers have in common with Quakers is a commitment to pacifism. Because when you're not fighting and arguing, in theory, this leads to a more harmonious and unified approach to life. The Shakers were the first group in the United States to receive conscientious objector status. So none of their members fought in the Civil War. And they gave, despite what I said earlier, they gave President Lincoln a chair in thanks for this designation. I've mentioned already that God is accessible to everyone. So God could reveal an idea or a sense of commitment or a suggestion to anyone, not just the leadership. And these revelations were generally called gifts. Those of you who may have a Christian background know that gift often means like a talent or something special that you can do that others can't. And in this case, it was literally messages that God shared. Sometimes the messages were interpreted as direct orders for behavior. So a Shaker leader might say that we have received the gift of understanding that we are to all go to bed at 8 p.m. But other times the gifts were more abstract, but also more encouraging, like sense that you can live this life. It's difficult, but I am here with you, and you will make it, and you are a part of the harmony that you are creating. And another belief, very important, this is an expression attributed to Mother Ann: hands to work, hearts to God. Anything you're doing is an act of worship. It wasn't just about going to the formal meetings that they had in the evenings and on Sunday morning. It was about putting your whole self into whatever you were doing. So whether you were using the paddle on the butter, which is what Sister Alice is doing there in the photograph on the left, or dancing in worship, you were worshiping God all the time. And that is in part because the Shakers believed that where they were living and what they were doing was a mirror, a reflection of heaven. So heaven it's certainly described as being perfect. And so things better be pretty perfect on earth too. So you don't see a lot of dirt at a Shaker village. We have some dirt at our village, so we are not doing as good a job as we should to adhere to this goal. But the Shakers, it's not an accident that the Shakers are credited with inventing the flat broom or developing the technology to do that. It's a broom that's more effective in sweeping up dirt, and a lot of even the designs of their buildings are made so that it's easier to clean. So they're a very practical people as well as a very spiritual people, but the practicality is leading to a better spiritual life. So finally, there are the last belief that they came to. They didn't start out with this, but this became a fundamental part of being a Shaker, and that is the commitment to communal living. So Mother Ann initially, while she did insist upon celibacy, was not necessarily thinking that you had to live in community to be a Shaker. But with all the beliefs that we've just been talking about, those are hard. Those are hard commitments in a world that doesn't always support this kind of behavior and commitment. So by gosh, living together must make it better, right? So that is why we end up with the communities that we do, the Shaker communities, and like the community at Hancock Shaker Village. So there's an image of the village, as you see it in 1830. Hancock was formed around 1790, the third village to be formed. And as I showed you on the map, most of the New England communities were formed within that decade. Hancock was one of the last to be inhabited by Shakers. It was lived in until 1959 and became a museum right after that. So we are fortunate that it never had a life other than something connected to the Shakers. So it's been a museum since 1961, and most of the buildings on the property are original to the site. As a communal group, as a group that lived together and away from what they called the world with a capital W and its various temptations and concerns, they had to provide for all of their needs. And virtually all of the Shaker communities, with the Philadelphia exception that I mentioned, were founded on farms. They were agricultural communities, rural areas, and they got their land from some of their early members, because as a communal society, when people joined the Shakers, they gave up ownership of any property that they had. So whether they had a lot of acres, or they had a great cow, or they happened to have some tools that were useful to the community, those all became part of the community and were accessible to the community. So Hancock happened to be founded on about 3 or 4 farms, family farms, and these families joined wholesale. So there were 20 or 30 people from each of these families that became Shakers. The barn, the big round barn that you see, that I mentioned this, was not there originally. That was built for the Shakers after they'd been and living here for about 35 years. They sort of knew by that point the type of architecture that they needed. Hancock is well known for its dairy farming, and that is why this barn was built It was built as a more efficient way to store hay to feed the cows and as a place to hold 52 cows at a time for milking. It is the only round barn at any of the Shaker communities. There was other architecture is similar between the different communities, but this barn is unique among the Shakers. You can see a view of the farmland, the pasture that's still part of our property today. So there are all kinds of things that needed to be grown to feed the animals, to feed people. So lots of work. They also needed a building for a living. So this brick dwelling, which is where a core number of Shakers at Hancock lived. You find a dwelling at all the Shakers communities because they didn't just live at the community, they lived together in the same building. These buildings are kind of like dorms. There are sleeping rooms for men and for women. There's a shared dining room, a shared meeting room for evening worship, and in this case, a wonderful kitchen for cooking. The building is actually divided in half. You can't tell from the outside. We'll see when we go inside in just a moment. And women were on the western, or in your, to help you out, on the left side of your screen. The men were on the right or the east side. And inside the building is a mirror image of the two sides. So in architecture, in this structure, the Shakers designed the building to exemplify the equality that they believed existed between men and women. So there's no better way to show that to you than the dining room doors. The dining room is the room we're in, looking out, and you see a door on the right. This is the door the brethren would have passed through and coming in for and leaving from meals. And the door on the left is for the sisters. And down at the other end of the hallway, there are also a pair of doors that lead into the meeting room where they would have gathered for worship. You see tables on either side of the dining room. The men would have eaten on the right, women on the left. But unless I told you this, you wouldn't know which side was which. There is no distinction between the two in terms of heating apparatus or types of tables or chairs. It is all the same. This is a view of one of the sleeping rooms. One of the things that is not listed as a Shaker belief or value, but is just happens to be the case, is there was no privacy as a Shaker. And this is part of the kind of humbling yourself to others. You followed the same schedule as everyone else. You went to bed at 8, you got up at 4:30, 5:30 in the winter. You did your chores, you ate the meals when they were prepared. So there's, again, not a lot of opportunity to be an individual, but the Shakers were not about individualism. So that's another way that they really work against the characteristic American idea that we're all in it for ourselves. You can see some great innovations in this bedroom. Notice that the beds have wheels. Another very practical, those of you who do clean your bedroom occasionally know that cleaning under the bed is very difficult. So, but when it's on wheels, that sure makes it a lot easier. So the beds are on wheels. There are all these pegs around the room for hanging things like that flat room I mentioned, or curtains that help keep your room warmer. Those are insulating curtains. The wonderful Shaker stove, and then two brethren. The brethren sitting in the chair probably doesn't get a lot of relaxing time, but he's demonstrating how that rocker is working for him. The Shakers, in addition to providing for their kind of daily needs with providing food and so forth, they did have a worship building, and this is it. This is the meeting house. Notice again, two doors, one for sisters, one for brothers. And just to envision what was happening inside, I've reused that image from the early 19th century of a Shaker meeting or Shaker worship service. Shaker worship services, after the initial years of kind of spontaneous whirling, speaking in tongues, the Shakers realized they kind of needed to organize worship to attract more followers, because worship and opening their meetings up to the general public that was an important way to attract new followers. One question you're probably all wondering is, if they were celibate, how did they expect to grow as a community? This is one of the key questions we get asked at the village. And they expected that their growth would come from adults who would see their worship, be inspired by the message of hope and salvation and the sort of sense of community, and want to join. And so being part of a lively worship service where the dancing in this case was more formalized into lines. Sometimes there were circles, but the men again are separated on one side from the women. Again, they have their hands in kind of a humble position. And they can make a lot of noise. You can picture they are on a wooden floor. They are wearing hard-soled shoes. They are singing in unison. These were loud and boisterous services that really showed the Holy Spirit at work. So the structure of the meeting house, that very simple architecture, this is an example of architecture that was universal for the Shaker communities in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. I believe ours is the only remaining intact original meeting house. Many of the communities grew too large for their meeting house, so they needed to build a new one. But this is an original late 18th century design by a Shaker, Moses Johnson. So when they weren't worshiping formally, they were working, but we know that working in anything was an act of worship. So in all the pictures I'm going to show you, they don't look like they're working, they're having their pictures taken, but normally they would have been working. So you see poultry care, which generally fell to the sisters for women's work. On the left, you have dairy herding there with some Shaker cows and Shaker brothers in front of the round stone barn. There was a lot of laundry to do. Most Shaker villages had between 100, 200, 300 members. A couple of them got up to 600 members. Hancock at its height had 300 members. This is laundry being done, I believe, at another Shaker village called Mount Lebanon, or it might be Canterbury, New Hampshire. But elaborate laundry facilities. Again, the Shakers knew that work was worship, but they didn't want to waste time. So anything that made the work more efficient, but still to be done well, was worth pursuing. So the Shakers are responsible for a number of technological innovations having to do with larger washing tubs, water-powered or powered in non-human powered laundry facilities, better ovens and stoves for cooking. The Shakers had water power at Hancock as early as very early 19th century, and that ran woodworking equipment as well as laundry equipment. So just lots of ways to not save on labor, but make labor better and more efficient and therefore more perfect. Laundry tended to be a woman's job, but you do see a brother in here helping with some of the heavier laundry pressing in the back. And then there was cooking. I mean, there's a lot of people to cook for. The Shakers were not people who denied themselves. They weren't about excess, but they also weren't about to struggle and sort of denial. So they ate very well. There's evidence of eating pie 3 times a day at some times of the year. This is maple sugaring season. They would be making maple candy, and sometimes to sell to the outside world, but also to consume. So sweets were fine. They ate a lot of dessert. On the right, you see corn being shucked. At times of the year when everyone was needed, everyone helped. So apple harvesting, apple picking, maple tapping, times when seeds needed to be gathered, it was kind of an all hands involved. I did mention selling maple candy, and one aspect of being a Shaker and living communally is that you really did not have much interaction with the outside world. But the Shakers as a group knew that they did need that world for some material things and also for new converts. So developing a relationship with the world was something that the Shakers worked on from the beginning. I mentioned that they're located in rural areas, but they are usually located on a major road in that area. So this building, and if you might recall an earlier image of the Hancock, what's now Route 20, which was the Albany Road at the time, runs right through the village. So you literally could pass the Shakers, see this really spectacular architecture for the early 19th century, and you would wonder, who are these people? Who could build something this impressive and this large? I am going to stop and ask questions, and maybe you will join. So one of the places that visitors from the world would stop is what became known as the trustee's office. The trustees are the people I mentioned who were in charge of the finances of the village and of the relationship, the sort of official relationship with the world. So there was often a little store as part of the office. And this is a later photo. So this is from the late 19th century of Hancock's trustee's office. So you see a sign, Shaker Fancy Work and Nut Candy. So they came to sell things that the world would want to buy, but they also sold products that they knew the world liked because the Shakers had made them and made them well. So among those things were the chair, the oval boxes, medicines. The Shakers were well known for making useful medicines, and also from the very beginning, seeds. So the Shakers, when they could do a product well and that they used within the community, but could also make in surplus for the world, they would do that. So early on, all the villages realized that seeds were something that the world needed to grow vegetables. So here's a list on the left of seeds available from Hancock, both for vegetables and also some herbs. I mentioned brooms. Most of the villages also made brooms. Here at Hancock, we made a lot of what are called yarn swifts. That's what's in the center, the lower center image. These are things that are used, very important for winding balls of yarn, and that rotates. So another person doesn't have to stand with their arms like this while you roll your ball of yarn. And then I mentioned medicines. Several of the Shaker communities became so good at growing herbs that were effective medicines that they got a lot of income from the sale of that. And the Shakers were the leading supplier of these medicines to what we now call the pharmaceutical industry in the 19th century. And their asthma cure was the #1 seller for quite some time. Undoubtedly, you may be wondering, if you've seen a few images of children, if these people are celibate, where are the children coming from? Well, there were children at Shaker communities, and they came in a couple of different ways. Sometimes, especially early on in Shaker history, whole families would join the Shakers. I mentioned that salvation was very important early on. I think it has become less so for most religious Christian groups since the late 18th century, but the kind of imminent fear of the world ending was very prominent in the late 18th century. And so whole families joined. It seemed like a minor thing to become celibate if it meant your soul would live in eternity. So their children came along too. And later on, as that became a less attractive place or idea for families to become part of a Shaker community, some families would just put their children into a Shaker community to live. Maybe they had a very large family and couldn't afford to care for all of them. Or perhaps the child was orphaned, or one of the parents had to travel for work and the other parent had died. The Shakers, in essence, became a wonderful place to be a foster community for a lot of children. And so over the years, they had a lot of children living with them. Most of them did not become Shakers as adults, but they had fond memories of being with the Shakers when they did leave the community to go out into the world, and often married and had children of their own. They would remember the Shakers and kind of pass along the word about this wonderful and loving group. So while they were at the village, they worked just like the adults. They worshiped in meeting, and they also went to school. So the girls went to school in the summer, the boys in the winter, so not at the same time. And despite the picture where they look a little grim, they did get a good and fun education. And they did, I love this picture. They didn't neglect their physical health, so they were doing PE as part of their instruction. I did want to touch briefly on the racial equality aspect of the Shakers. There were Black Shakers as early as 1783 at the first Shaker community in Watervliet, and there have been people of color at many of the villages throughout their history. As you can imagine, it's the reality of integrating people of color into a mostly white community could be challenging, especially in the Kentucky and Ohio communities. But the Shakers worked sort of practically to integrate their communities, but also dealt with some difficulties. For example, if an enslaver and his family joined one of the Kentucky communities and had enslaved people among what he brought with him, that was property, and you were expected to give over all of your property to the Shakers. The Shakers did not want to own people. The Shakers did not believe in slavery. So did they free the people who came, the enslaved people who came with the enslavers? It got quite complicated. So one of the communities developed a Black part of the community where those Shakers lived. Others integrated them into the white dwellings, but they were kind of confronted head on with what does it mean to be a racially equal society. The really interesting community in Philadelphia was founded by a Black woman who joined the Shakers in Watervliet and felt strongly that she would like to try this type of community in her hometown of Philadelphia. And she eventually was granted permission by the Shaker hierarchy to start a community there. And they lived in row housing down in the main part of the city and did work as laundresses, as domestic servants, and really succeeded quite well in the community till the late 19th century, when the last of those community members went back up to Watervliet to live. There's just a couple of images to show you. Phoebe Lane on the left was a member of the Watervliet, the first Shaker community, for 74 years. She died in her 90s as a Shaker. And on the right, that image that we've looked at a couple of times, you see in the back row two brethren of color. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, when this print was reproduced throughout the 19th century, they are often cropped out of the publication, made the choice not to include them. These were not Shaker publications, but just sort of goes to show that even in presentation, sometimes the reality of the Shaker experience wasn't properly presented to the world. I want to end with this, well, I have a couple other slides, but this image, I like to think that the sun is in these young people's eyes, these Shakers standing out in the road, getting their picture taken because they look a little unhappy. But on the whole, the Shaker experience for those who chose to live it was a very joyful one. They were a people who were committed to making the world a better place in their own view, and they really succeeded quite well in many ways. I think the question as to whether why didn't they die out? What did they think being celibate, that didn't they know they would die out? Well, I think it's amazing they are still around and didn't die out even in spite of being celibate. I think they have a lot to teach us about our own expectations for who we can be. So here we have a lovely parting view of some Shakers to kind of end our experience. If you're interested in learning more, because we are presenting this program through a wonderful library, I did provide some books that you might be interested in checking out. The Shaker Experience in America by Stephen Stein is kind of it's a long book, but it's a really interesting read. It's a very thorough history of the Shakers in America. It's still the book that we recommend our interpreters read. And it takes a while to get through, but it's definitely worth it. Shaker Communities, Shaker Lives by Priscilla Brewer is more of a day-to-day experience of the Shakers. It's very much grounded in a lot of primary resources. So is Stephen Stein's book, but Brewer's book is a little bit more, quotes a lot from sort of daily experiences, and you get a better sense of what it was like to live in a Shaker community. The Great Divorce focuses on a specific time in the Shaker experience very early on, when there was a lot of tension. When I mentioned that families would join the Shakers, that was not always a universally agreed upon decision. So one of the earliest divorce cases in New York actually involves a Shaker family. The husband decided he wanted to become a Shaker. That was the best way he could figure out to try to live a sinless life. His wife was not on board. The children went with him, and the wife spent a lot of time trying to get her children back. And Ilian Wu's book describes that story in great detail. I would describe it as narrative nonfiction. Like the Willow Tree, for those of you who need a little bit shorter introduction, is a wonderful kind of middle grade book by Lois Lowry, same author of The Giver, in the Dear America series, that describes the fictional account of a young woman who goes to live with the Maine Shakers during the flu pandemic of 1918. So it might feel a little too close to home to read right now, but because there are a lot of parallels to our own recent experience, but it nevertheless gives you a good look at Shaker life in the 20th century. Shakers did change a fair amount from the 19th to the 20th century, particularly in kind of relaxing a little bit about working quite so hard. Life just wasn't as difficult, so they had a little more time for play and travel, but they still tended to stay in their community. So that's a good book. And then if you're interested in the objects in the chairs and other things, Gather Up the Fragments, the Andrews Shaker collection, is this a magnificent catalog of what happens to be the core of the collection at Hancock Shaker Village, but just really wonderful images and great captions explaining, kind of what makes what the different pieces are, where they came from, and some good preview material at the beginning. So I hope you might like to come see Hancock Shaker Village in the flesh. And if you do, our website's a great place to get started. You won't see all these people gathered on the front steps of the brick dwelling, but nevertheless, we try to embody their spirit of welcome. And we will hit you right away, though, for the first 3 weeks with a lot of animals. We do have animals on the farm, and about a third of our visitation comes in the first 3 weeks to see these baby animals that are also part of the Shaker legacy. So thank you so much. I'm really happy to answer a few questions. And as you can see, there's a lot to share about the Shakers. So happy to talk.
Thank you so much, Cindy. This has been wonderful. Now I have a question that I might not be alone here.
Sure.
In any of like the diaries, journals that have been found, has anyone talked about swaying from the celibate life?
So that's a very good question. And as you can imagine, one often asked. And the answer really, it might be surprising, but there's surprisingly little evidence of um, a lot of disregard for the celibacy um, requirement, you could say. And I think there are a couple reasons for that. One is that the Shakers realized early on that this life was not for everyone. And so they developed a kind of staged process for becoming officially a Shaker. And each village had what they called the gathering order, where new people would live before fully committing to Shaker life. You did have to live celibately in the gathering order, and you did have to work. But it was easier to leave the community if it wasn't fitting your goals very well from there. And so people would come and live as a Shaker for a few years, then they would leave. Some would return again. And so allowing that fluidity, I think, allowed for a little bit of it made for a less strict environment. You had to be strict while you were at the Shaker community, but if you chose to leave, you could live, the way of the world. I think also, people who wanted to become Shakers, this was not a surprise. Celibacy was not, sprung on you after you signed the dotted line. So if it wasn't for you, people just didn't join. There are examples of people really struggling with being celibate, but trying very hard to maintain this life. And this didn't just mean like the physical act of having sex, but thinking about sex and being obsessed with someone else or being attracted to someone else. And those were difficult struggles that aren't always written about, but there are a couple private journals. People weren't supposed to keep those but that did survive. And you can tell the real difficulty of not wanting to have these thoughts and feelings and really fighting against them. So certainly there are a few examples of people falling in love. If you did get pregnant, which didn't happen too often, it was pretty clear you had violated the celibacy rule. So you would be asked to leave, but you would not be shunned. You would be sent away with some provisions to help you in your new life. So it's not something the Shakers have ever wanted to give up. It means that much to them to live this way, but they recognize that it is a strong human tendency, and that it isn't something that everyone can do.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Now, someone wrote in the chat, it's interesting that although they promoted equality between sexes, they had many chores assigned by gender.
Yes, that's very true. And so that they were not groundbreaking radical feminists. I think when we think about that some at our workplace, some of it's practical. Since they're joining as adults, they're coming in with a set of skills that would reflect the community's expectations of gender. And so it's kind of, in this case, it would be natural that women would come with the ability to cook, to clean, whether they liked it or not, to sew. And then the men would be expected to do the heavier lifting, agricultural work, woodworking, and so forth. One thing that this will make you question this value, but the women were expected to clean the men's rooms when they weren't in them. I'm not sure how that got past the equality part, but I think the difference is, and what the Shakers would have argued, is that the work was valued equally. So the work was done to support each other. So the brothers might be out growing the vegetables, but they knew the sisters would do good work with them in the kitchen. Same way that the brothers would chop the firewood for the stoves, for the kitchen, or for everyone to have heat, and everyone appreciated the work. It wasn't women's work, meaning it was devalued. It was just the work that the women happened to do.
Why did men and women eat at separate tables?
So that is part of the literally physically separating them. They also ate in silence. Mealtime was not chat time, wasn't downtime. It was time to focus on being grateful for having a meal at all. And then you got right back out and got to work. You were allowed to eat as much as you wanted, but you had to eat what you took. So there's an expression, shaker your plate, which essentially meant you had to be a member of the clean plate club. But in the same way that they separated men and women in their living quarters and in their work, they also literally separated them in the dining room.
Someone was curious how old the two remaining Shakers are and if the religion will die with them.
So Brother Arnold is in his 60s, and he has been a Shaker for quite a while, but joined into his adulthood. And Sister June is in her 70s, and I don't recall her story as well. I believe she also had joined into her adulthood. Sister Frances Carr, who was the most recent Shaker to die, had been raised by the Shakers and then joined as an adult. So she has some interesting written material as well. She has a cookbook, and she was also quite a good public spokesperson for the Shakers. They don't think the religion will die out. They certainly hope not, but I think they are aware that there are a few of them. If you go to their website, you discover that there's a whole tab about how to become a Shaker, and they just had a young man living with them for a number of years who they were calling Brother Andrew, who recently left. But they still welcome people. There is a saying that Mother Ann said that when we are down to the number we can count on one hand, that is when we will grow again. So I think there is always a positive hope, but I'm not sure growing is not their main goal. Their main goal is to focus on their spiritual life and health. I think we're lucky that the Shakers have left such a legacy, not only materially, but also through their writings and just general beliefs that they will live on for even if there are no official Shakers.
I have one question for you about orphans. Now, were there orphanages that they worked with? If there was like children that were not getting adopted, they would take them in, or how did that work? If you can share, if you know.
Yes, so taking in children who were orphans, my understanding is started sort of informally, because the sort of social welfare system in America, not slow to develop, but developed after the Shakers had formed. So here are communities that have a reputation of being safe. They are the people who live in them are kind. There's food, there are places to live, there's a school. And so informally, people would hear about this and stop and ask if their child, if it wasn't a complete orphan, or maybe it's an aunt who's raising a niece or nephew. As time went on, and there were social systems, I don't know that the Shakers were a place that were turned to for that. I think it was more of a kind of personal commitment, but that's a really good question. I wouldn't be surprised if it was different in different locations. Because certainly the Shakers there was actually controversy among the Shakers about this idea of taking in children as future members, because some people felt it was a waste of time and a waste of resources, and other people saw it as a mission and a goal. So even internally, they weren't always sure. But I don't know fully the answer to that. But my sense is it was more of a kind of case by case, family to family connection.
I was curious. Thank you. I just want to remind everyone that we have another program Shaker Architecture and Design on Tuesday, May 10th at 7 p.m. Same place, same time, different link. So if you'd like to join, please register. We'd love to see you again.
Yes, and that might repeat. There might be a quiz for people who are coming back, but that will focus a little bit more on some of the objects and the buildings and sort of their design and how that reinforced some of the beliefs we talked about tonight. And again, sort of talks about the perfectionism and craftsmanship.
There's limited distractions, so everything should be perfect.
Exactly. Right. Well, there's something to be said for that. Yes.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful, and I've learned a lot.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Let's see. Someone just said it's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all for coming. And I hope you'll discover ways that the Shakers intersect with your lives. Go sweep your kitchen floor with your flat broom, and already the Shakers are helping you.
I know I want to research what else they've invented, but I know I think you mentioned they didn't patent a lot of their inventions, but I'm very curious what I use every day that is because of them.
One thing you all may use if you plant anything is the Shakers did develop the paper seed packet that we are accustomed to using. They, as a better method of sale, they package seeds in small quantities in paper packets. And so that is another Shaker invention that you are benefiting from.
It's great. I love it. Thank you again. And I hope everyone has a wonderful night.
Yes, thank you so much.
Bye.